They call it the white silence. It's not a lack of sound, it's a presence. It's a heavy, suffocating blanket of cold that settles over the Manti Range, pressing down until the very mountains seem to groan under the weight of the sky. For Silas Thorne, 68 years of hard living had prepared him for many things. He had survived the fever of 88, the loss of his wife Martha to the silent spring, and the long, lonely decades of trapping the high country. But as the shelf of ice groaned and collapsed over the mouth of his makeshift stone sanctuary, Silas realized that all his years of wisdom were being weighed against a single, terrifying truth. Nature does not care if you are ready to die. The air in the cave grew thin, tasting of stone and ancient dust. Outside, the temperature had plummeted to 40 degrees below zero, a cold so sharp it could shatter a steel blade. Inside, Silas was a prisoner. His legs, once capable of trekking 20 miles a day through knee-deep powder, now throbbed with a dull, arthritic ache that felt like rusted iron. He sat on the frozen dirt floor, the darkness closing in around him like a shroud. "Not like this," he whispered. His voice sounded like dry parchment tearing. It was the first time he had spoken in 3 weeks, and the sound of it frightened him. It was the voice of a ghost. He reached into his pocket, his fingers fumbling with a small silver locket, the only thing he had left of Martha. His thumb traced the worn engraving on the back. He couldn't see it in the dark, but he knew every scratch, every curve. It was his anchor. If he let go of that locket, he knew the white silence would claim his mind before the cold claimed his heart. Before we continue our journey into the wild, subscribe to Wildbound History and tell us in the comments, what country and city are you watching from? This was the beginning of the end, or perhaps the beginning of the hardest fight Silas Thorne would ever wage. It wasn't a fight against wolves or bears. It was a fight against the ticking of a clock that no longer existed. He had 4 months of winter ahead of him, a handful of dried meat and a fire that refused to catch. The first night was the loudest. The wind screamed through the cracks in the rock, a banshee wail that mocked his solitude. Silas huddled in his furs, his eyes wide, staring into the pitch black. He thought of the warmth of a kitchen he hadn't seen in 20 years. He thought of the smell of fresh bread, but mostly he thought of the silence. It was a physical thing clawing at his ears, begging him to give up, to simply close his eyes and let the frost turn him into a statue of salt and bone. "I'm still here," he croaked into the void. But as the ice outside thickened, sealing him into his tomb, Silas wondered if he was talking to God, or if he was already talking to the shadows. To survive the crushing weight of the present, a man must often flee into the sanctuary of the past. But for Silas, the past was a double-edged blade. It provided the warmth he lacked, yet it sharpened the agony of his current isolation. As the blizzard roared outside, a relentless rhythmic thumping against the frozen stone, Silas closed his eyes. Suddenly, the air was no longer thin and frozen. It was thick with the scent of wild clover and wood smoke. He wasn't in a tomb. He was on the porch of the cabin he had built with his own 2 hands in the valley below. He could see her, Martha. She was wearing that faded blue apron, the one stained with the juice of mountain berries. She was younger then, her hair a crown of chestnut gold before the silver of time had claimed it. She didn't speak. In Silas's memory, she never needed to. She simply moved with a grace that made the harsh wilderness feel like a cathedral. She was leaning over a cast-iron stove, the clinking of the lid a melody more beautiful than any hymn. In the cave, Silas's fingers twitched, mimicking the motion of holding her hand. He remembered the calluses on her palms, marks of a woman who had worked the earth alongside him, who had buried 3 children in the cold mountain soil without ever losing her faith. They had spent 40 years in a comfortable silence, a language of glances and shared burdens. "The coffee's hot, Silas," he imagined her saying. He could almost taste the bitterness of the chicory, feel the steam softening his weathered skin. But then, the mountain would remind him of its presence. A frost quake, the sound of rock splitting under the pressure of extreme cold, would crack like a rifle shot, shattering the vision. Silas would bolt upright, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. The contrast was a physical blow. The golden sunlight of the valley was replaced by the oppressive blue-gray gloom of the cave. The smell of baking bread was gone, replaced by the pungent, oily scent of old wood smoke and his own unwashed body. He was no longer a husband, a provider, or a man of a household. He was a scavenger, a ghost in a stone throat. The psychological toll of these memories was a dangerous game. In the second month of his entombment, Silas began to realize that the white silence used your own love against you. It beckoned you to sleep, promising that if you just closed your eyes, you could stay in that kitchen with Martha forever. It told him that the struggle to keep the fire going, to crawl on hands and knees to shave off bits of bark from his dwindling supply of wood, was no longer worth the effort. "Why wake up?" the wind seemed to whisper. "She's waiting in the warmth. Just let the fire go out, Silas. It's so much easier to sleep." His hands, gnarled and stiff with arthritis, throbbed in the cold. Every movement was a negotiation with pain. He looked at his fingers, the same fingers that had once carved a cradle, that had held Martha's shaking hands as she drew her final breath. They were grey now, the nails cracked and black. He realized then that he wasn't just fighting for his life, he was fighting for his dignity. If he died here, curled in a ball like a whipped dog, the memory of the man Martha loved would die with him. He had to remain the man she believed him to be, the man who could endure anything. He would spend hours talking to the wall, recounting the stories of their youth. He told the stones about the time they lost the mule in the river, and how Martha had laughed until she cried despite the danger. He told the shadows about the way the light hit the aspens in October. He was anchoring his mind to the world of the living, with a chain made of memories, terrified that if he stopped speaking, he would forget the sound of a human heart. But the wood was running low. The white silence was patient. It didn't need to attack him. It only had to wait for him to run out of ghosts to talk to. By the third month, the hunger is no longer a sharp pain. It becomes a dull, rhythmic thrumming, like a drum beaten deep underground. But as the body shrinks, the mind expands in terrifying ways. This is the stage of isolation the old-timers called the whispering fever. The silence of the Manti Range had stopped being empty. It began to populate itself. Silas Thorne was no longer alone in the cave, or at least his mind refused to believe he was. In the periphery of his vision, shadows began to detach themselves from the rock. They were the mind's creatures, the hallucinations born of darkness, sensory deprivation, and the relentless sub-zero pressure. "I see you," Silas croaked. His voice was a dry rattle, barely recognizable as human. The threat wasn't a wolf at the door, it was the cabin fever that turns a man's own thoughts into predators. He began to hear things, not just the wind, but footsteps. Heavy, crunching footsteps on the snow outside that would stop the moment he held his breath. He heard the sound of a fiddle playing a mournful tune just out of reach, and the muffled laughter of men he had buried 40 years ago. The isolation was a physical weight, pressing against his temples. The cave, once a sanctuary, was now a throat, slowly swallowing him. Every crack of the frost-heaved stone sounded like a giant's footstep. Every flicker of the fire looked like a reaching hand. The greatest threat was the sweet lethargy. It's the physiological trick the brain plays when it's starving and freezing. It tells you that the floor is a soft bed. It tells you that the cold is actually a warm blanket. Silas found himself sitting for hours, staring at a single spot on the wall, his mind drifting into a grey void where time didn't exist. He realized with a jolt of primal terror that he had forgotten what day it was. He had forgotten the face of his own mother. The white silence was erasing him, pixel by pixel, layer by layer, until he was nothing more than a breathing stone. "Fight it, Silas," he hissed, slamming his fist against his thigh to wake the nerves. The pain was a gift. It was proof of life. The psychological pressure peaked when the wind talker arrived. That's what the mountain men called the auditory hallucinations that mimic a loved one's distress. For 3 nights, Silas sat paralyzed as he heard Martha's voice calling his name from the blizzard outside. "Silas, help me! It's so cold, Silas!" He knew it wasn't real. He knew she was resting in the churchyard 500 miles away. But the heart is not a logical organ. He stood at the edge of the cave's ice wall, his hands trembling on the frozen barrier, ready to tear it down with his bare fingernails to save a ghost. He stood there for hours, tears streaming down his face, freezing into jagged ice claws on his cheeks, caught between the urge to run into the white death and the iron will to survive. "You're dead, Martha," he sobbed, his forehead pressed against the ice. "You're gone. Leave me be. Please, just leave me be." He sank to his knees, the silence returning with a vengeance. He was alone, truly, horribly alone. The world had forgotten Silas Thorne, and the mountain was simply waiting for the fire to go out so it could finish the job. The fire sputtered, casting a final desperate shadow against the wall. Silas looked at his hands. They were no longer the hands of a trapper. They were the hands of a man who had stared into the abyss and realized the abyss was staring back, waiting for him to blink. Day 110. The body is a miracle of stubbornness, but even miracles have an expiration date. Silas Thorne was dying, not from a single wound, but from the slow theft of his heat. His core temperature was dropping, and with it, the last of his iron resolve. The white silence had finally breached the walls. In his delirium, Silas reached for his tinderbox. His fingers were no longer tools. They were stiff, frozen sausages that refused to obey. He knocked the box over, and the sound of it hitting the dirt was like a thunderclap in the oppressive quiet. He watched, as if in slow motion, as his very last match rolled into a crack in the frozen earth. "No! No, please!" he wheezed. He found it. The small wooden stick felt like a mountain in his hand, but his hands were shaking so violently from the advanced stages of hypothermia that he couldn't grip it. He tried to strike it against the dry stone, but his coordination was gone. Snap! The match head broke off, unlit. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the sound of a life ending. Silas let out a ragged sob, his head falling onto his crossed arms. This was the moment the mountain had been waiting for. The fire was out, the light was gone, the darkness was total. Something sparked in the wreckage of his mind. Not a fire, but a memory of a different kind. He remembered Martha's voice, not the ghost voice from the wind, but the real one. "Silas Thorne, you were never a man to leave a job half done." A primal, ancient rage surged through his veins, a final flare-up of the human spirit. If he was going to die, he wouldn't die as a victim. He would die as a man who fought until the very molecules of his body gave out. With a roar that was half scream and half prayer, Silas forced himself up. He didn't have matches. He didn't have dry kindling, but he had his survival. He took his rusted skinning knife and, with a grimace of pure agony, sliced a strip of leather from his own belt. He began to shave off the dry inner layers of his fur coat, the only dry material left. Strike, strike, strike. "Burn, you devil!" he screamed at the darkness. "Burn!" A spark landed on the fine hairs of the fur. A tiny, microscopic orange glow appeared. Silas held his breath. His actual life depended on the next 10 seconds. He leaned in, his face inches from the spark, and blew. It wasn't a breath. It was a soul being poured into a flame. The fur smoldered. A curl of grey smoke rose, and then a tiny, beautiful, golden flame licked upward. He huddled over that tiny flame like it was a newborn child. He fed it the last of his wooden stool, then a piece of his own gear. The heat hit his face, and for the first time in 4 months, Silas Thorne didn't just feel cold. He felt the burning, stinging, glorious pain of being alive. He had survived the climax of his own extinction. He sat there, bathed in the gold, and for the first time in 100 days he smiled. It was a terrifying, toothless grin. but it was the grin of a conqueror. Nature has a way of ending its trials, not with a grand fanfare, but with a whisper. On the 120th day, the white silence finally broke. The temperature rose just enough for the ice wall sealing the cave to groan and weep. Silas Thorne didn't move at first. He sat in the center of his stone world, surrounded by the charred remains of everything he had owned. He had burned his extra boots. He had burned the handles of his traps. He had even burned the wooden frame of Martha's locket, keeping only the silver heart. He was a man stripped down to his very essence, nothing left but skin, bone, and a spirit that refused to break. As the ice wall thinned, a spear of genuine sunlight cut through the gloom. It hit Silas squarely in the eyes. He flinched, the light feeling like a physical blow after months of grey twilight. The air hit him first. It wasn't the killing bite of December. It was the sharp, pine-scented promise of April. Silas collapsed onto the snow outside the cave, his face buried in the cold powder. He didn't care about the dampness. He was breathing air that hadn't been trapped in a tomb. He looked down the Manti Range. The valley below was still white, but the edges were softening into a muddy green. He had survived, but as he looked at his reflection in a pool of melted snow, he saw the price of his victory. His hair had turned a shock of snowy white. His face was a road map of deep, permanent trenches. He had lost 40 pounds, his clothes hanging off his frame like rags on a scarecrow. The aftermath of survival is a strange, quiet place. There is no joy in the way a younger man might feel it. Instead, there is a profound, heavy peace. The fears that had haunted him, the ghosts of Martha, the mind's creatures, had vanished in the sunlight. They were products of the dark, and the dark had been defeated. He realized then that he was not the same man who had crawled into that cave to escape the storm 4 months ago. That Silas Thorne had died somewhere in the second month. This new man was something harder, something forged in the absolute zero of isolation. He felt a strange gratitude for the pain, for the hunger, and even for the silence. They had stripped away the trivialities of life, leaving him with a clarity he hadn't possessed in 60 years. Life was simple. There is the breath in your lungs, the heat in your blood, and the memory of those you loved. Everything else is just wind. He wasn't going back to his old life. He couldn't. He was a survivor of the white silence, a member of a grim and silent brotherhood who knew exactly how much a human soul could endure before it shattered. He walked toward the valley, a ghost returning to the world of the living, carrying nothing but a silver locket and the hard-won wisdom of the mountain. The mountain had tried to claim him, to make him a part of its eternal stillness. But Silas Thorne was still moving, and as long as he was moving, he was winning. The story of Silas Thorne is not merely a tale of wood smoke and mountain ice. It is a testament to the iron weave of the human spirit. We live in an age of constant noise, where silence is something we flee from and discomfort is something we pay to avoid. But for our ancestors, the silence was a mirror and the cold was a forge. Silas survived because he refused to let the fire in his heart go out long after the fire in his hearth had turned to ash. He reminds us that resilience isn't the absence of fear, but the decision to keep moving when fear is the only thing you have left. To those of you watching who have faced your own winters, the loss of a partner, the slowing of your step, or the long nights of isolation, know that you carry the same ancient ember within you. The frontier may be gone from the maps, but its spirit lives on in every person who chooses to stand tall against the storms of time. We are the descendants of those who did not break. We are the legacy of the white silence. He lived another 14 years after that winter. They say he never spoke much after he came down the mountain, but he always kept a fire burning in his small cabin, even in the height of summer. He knew, better than anyone, that light is a gift you have to earn every single day. Thank you for exploring the untamed past with us here at Wildbound History. If you believe the spirit of the frontier still lives, hit the like button and subscribe for our next survival story. Until next time, stay wild.